to maybe provide a complimentary address to that of Kevin Wright, as we really start now to drill down into the exact nature of the Chinese consumer or different regional Chinese consumers. So please welcome Geoff Raby.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks also to Tourism Australia for very kindly inviting me here to speak today. And good afternoon, everyone. We've had a lot of information this morning, and I'm sure you're starting to feel a bit of information overload. In a sense, the Foreign Minister summarised a large part of what I'm about to say. But then again, I think to the extent one theme's emerged through the morning's discussions, and that is the significance and in fact singular importance of the China market for Australia, it's worth spending some time looking closely at what's driving that market, understanding a bit more of the economic fundamentals, and thinking about where that market might go in the future in terms of size and, as the Foreign Minister referred to, its regional dimensions within China. So today I want to make 3 points, and I hope that these will contribute to your decision-making and your discussions. The first is this question of China's long-term growth. And at present, there is a lot of international uncertainty in markets about where China is going. I'm very bullish about China, and I'll give you some reasons why I think that's very well based. Secondly, over the past 5 years, as the Foreign Minister said, China's economic growth has spread widely within the country. And this is opening up new middle-class markets in places which many people in the room here today will never have heard of. And these are the so-called second and third tier cities, but there are even fourth and fifth tier cities. And these places are only just beginning to receive marketing attention. Thirdly, the type of middle-class tourist that is emerging, courtesy of China's rapidly rising incomes, is, in my view, an interesting mix of high disposable income, as we've seen. They're very good spenders. It was noted this morning, I think, that whilst China has the second largest number of tourists to Australia, they're the highest spending tourists. They're internationally oriented. They're increasingly English-speaking, and I think this is a big contrast you'll find with the boom in Japanese tourism from the 70s, 80s. China is emerging as one of the largest English-speaking markets in the world, as most Chinese under the age of 25 have been given quite considerable English language training. But yet, it's an unsophisticated market, in my view, in terms of the range of its interests and its curiosity about foreign cultures and lands. If I'm close to the mark, and of course these comments are inevitably generalisations, and I'm sure there are numerous exceptions to them, but if I am close to the mark, I do believe China, notwithstanding its rapid growth and its size, poses very significant marketing challenges for Australia, in that we have to think about China as a market in a way perhaps we haven't thought about other markets. But turning first of all to the Chinese economic growth outlook. As we know, tourism is closely connected with economic development and the associated growth of per capita income. Having an informed assessment about this obviously is critically important for planning and for investment decisions in this industry. China has done many remarkable things in its 33 years of open door and reform policies. One thing it hasn't done, though, is abolish the business cycle. And we're currently at a phase in the business cycle where the government is tightening policy, and has been for a little while, in order to wind back on inflation and to let the air out of a number of inflationary bubbles which exist across many asset classes in China today. Nevertheless, in the short term, this year, next year, I think China's economic growth rate will still be very robust, in the order of 9% this year and perhaps 8% or at the high 8% range next year. So for China's economy, perhaps it's not alone in the world, it does have some deep structural imbalances which government policy is trying to address. a lot of this comes from a very rapid expansion of credit following GFC, whereas we stimulate our economy through fiscal expansion, China stimulated it through monetary expansion. And so this has fed through into inflationary pressures. And also China has imbalances on the external account coming from its control over capital flows and its managed exchange rate. A result of China's imbalanced economic model has been that economic growth has been driven by investment in fixed capital and infrastructure on one hand, and manufactured exports on the other. Now, I don't intend to go into the merits of this growth model that has sustained China for many decades, but rather just to point out that the Chinese government itself is seeking to address the imbalances in the economy, both in the short term through monetary policy, but in the longer term through major structural rebalancing of the economy. And the Foreign Minister spoke about this this morning when he referred to the 12th five-year plan, which came out in March of this year, where the government is trying to shift the weight for economic growth away from fixed capital formation and exports to domestic household consumption. This will, of course, lead to an increase in the quality of lives of citizens in China. It does have very big implications for the tourist sector, as we should see, if incomes continue to grow, a considerable increase in recreational activities, including both domestic and international tourism. When we look at China's economy in the longer term, though, I am very optimistic about its potential for growth. If we think 20 years ahead, I think it's not unreasonable for your planning horizons and your planning decisions to be based upon China's economy being at least 4 times bigger in 20 years than it is today. It's already the second largest economy in the world. Now consider this if you think that notion is fanciful. You only have to grow at 7.5% per annum annual average GDP for a decade to double GDP in a decade. But I think there's no doubt that China will double its GDP this decade, and I'm also confident China will double its GDP in the following decade. If you consider the past 33 years of reform, over that period, China has averaged an annual average growth rate of 10%. And that's notwithstanding many shocks to the system, including the years before and around the June 4, 1984 Tianjin Square events. So I think 7.5% annual average growth sustained over 20 years is in fact well within China's growth experience and well within China's growth potential. There is some concern about headwinds, and one of them that is frequently referred to is on demography. China's population is growing and ageing quite rapidly. It's estimated that in 2015, the dependency ratio will for the first time begin to rise in China. And that means more and more people, fewer and fewer people will have to support more and more dependents. So there is concern that China may become grey before it becomes wealthy. And the reference here, of course, is to Japan. My view, though, is that a Japanese-style descent in the long-run low-level equilibrium track is most unlikely for China over the next 20 years. Apart from China's much stronger fiscal position than Japan's at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, China's per capita income is still quite low. It's still about $4,500 US in nominal terms. So China is still a developing country. Its income, of course, is also very unequal, and this unequal distribution in many ways gives us a very large numerical middle class that is of interest to us in marketing Australia as a tourist destination. There are big numbers, 200 million, who are high-income, affluent urban consumers, and the ranks of these people will continue to swell. I quickly want to just run through what I think are the 4 main drivers of this long-term growth in China's economy. My view is that, notwithstanding the headwinds, and providing there is no major external shock, such as a prolonged political crisis, then a quadrupling of China's GDP over the next 20 years is quite a realistic outcome. Firstly, is urbanisation. Foreign Minister referred to this morning as well. Over 50% of China's population now lives in urban areas, but this is very low by international standards. And even though it does represent a remarkable change over the past 20 years in China. Over the next 15 years, it's expected that a further 300 million people will move into cities. This will give China the greatest urban population on the planet, with some 1 billion people living in cities. But this will still only be about 70% or so of China's projected population at that time. Bear in mind that when people move from rural employment to urban employment, their productivity rises as urban productivity is higher than rural productivity, but also, for those who remain on the land, their productivity rises as the opportunities for economies of scale can be realised. My second point is that China is also way inside the global productivity, the global production possibility frontier. This is a difficult concept, it's hard to measure, and I can give you anecdotal evidence for that, but I think it's true to say, and looking at China's average levels of capital consumption, whether it's steel or automobiles or whatever else, China still has a long period ahead of it to continue to draw down on the world's stock of technology and ideas before it catches up with the world leaders. China, over the past 15 years, and this is my third point, has invested massively in infrastructure. The past decade in China is similar to that of the Eisenhower decade in the 1950s in the United States, when 6-lane, high-quality freeways were laid across the continent. China has done this and largely completed that construction exercise. It's now turning its attention massively to rail transport as well as air transport, with some 200 new airports about to be built. On the rail transport issue, it's been controversial recently with the much publicised, I think exaggerated implications of the crash of the high-speed train recently, with the loss of a small number of lives. The point is that China's transport system is very heavily congested, and if China is able to reduce transport costs and link together this big, vast continental economy as a single market, then the opportunities for regional specialisation are enormous, and with that, further growth of productivity. Fourthly, is the capital account restrictions and the increasing liberalisation, or I should say internationalisation of the use of the renminbi. The government's clearly taken the decision that the renminbi will be used increasingly for international transactions. As this happens, and of course it'll be very good for tourism, outbound tourism to China, this will also drag along, albeit haltingly and fleetingly, liberalisation of the form of China's capital account, and those two developments, renminbi convertibility over time and capital account reform, will drive, again, another round of very significant productivity growth through the Chinese economy. So they're just 4 reasons. I'm sure there are more, but I think we can safely, barring some major external shock, do our planning on the basis of the Chinese economy 4 times bigger than what it is today. The Foreign Minister spoke eloquently at length about the move of China's economic development from the eastern seaboard to the southwest, the far west, and the northeast. And this draws in very large numbers of new middle-class consumers and potential tourists. He mentioned the trade delegation, Emerson trade minister letter this year. I would add that in 2009, it was Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, the first time he began the Foreign Minister's visit, not in Beijing or Shanghai, but he went to Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province. Sichuan has a population of 98 million people. Chengdu has a population of about 8 or 9 million people. And to give you a feel for sort of what it means to be middle class in these places, although Chengdu's population is much smaller than that of Beijing or Guangzhou, Chengdu has the second highest